Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to take a look at the Anbernic RG Vita Pro. About a month ago, I did an early look video at the non-Pro version of the RG Vita. Same shell and same buttons, but with a couple other key differences. The Pro version that we're testing here today has a different chipset and a 1080p display, and it also can dual boot into both Android and Linux. In many ways, it feels like an upgrade of the old school Anbernic devices that we used to see back in the day, but of course it's also got its own share of issues too, and we'll go over all that here in this video. Like with many Anbernic devices, it's still a bit of a work in progress in terms of software, and we'll talk about that here in this video, but I do think we have enough data to make a preliminary review, and so that's what I'm going to call it here today. Either way, grab your favorite snack and drink, and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, before we get started, for some reason Anbernic sent me two of the exact same device to review. I'm not sure what's going on here. They're both the same black RG Vita Pro. Now obviously I do not need two of these things, so I'm going to give one of them away. I'll have it linked down in the video description below. All you have to do is just sign up, tell me your favorite snack and drink, and from there I'll just leave the giveaway open for about a week. I'll leave it open to anybody in the world and I'll send it over to you if you win. And like with all my videos, all opinions are my own. No money was exchanged in any way, and they're not going to see this one ahead of time. Let's talk about the specs. Number one is this new CPU. It's the Rockchip RK3576. This is an 8-core CPU, and it's never been used in a handheld before. The great thing about this one is that it's capable of both Android and Linux dual booting, which we will test out thoroughly in this video. This device also comes with 4 GB of RAM compared to the non-Pro, which only has 3, but it only has 64 GB of internal storage. It does have 2 microSD card slots, so that comes in really handy, where you can use the first SD card slot for your Linux-based firmware and the second microSD card slot to host all your games, and then access the same games both on Android and Linux. The display is slightly different than the non-Pro version as well. It's still 5.5 inches in a touchscreen LCD, but this one has a higher resolution of 1080p. The battery size is decent, it's 5,000 milliamp hours, and I did some testing earlier today. On the far right, I played a lightweight game, Final Fantasy Adventure on the Game Boy, and this one ran for a little under 8.5 hours. In the center, I played a PSP game at a 3x resolution and got a little bit under 5 hours, and considering that this device really feels like it's made for PSP, that's about where you're going to be expecting it there on average. On the left side, I pushed the CPU as hard as I could, so I played God of War PS2, which of note does not play at full speed on this device, but you can see here that just pushing it as far as I could, I got a little bit under 3.5 hours of battery life there. So when it comes to the games you'll probably actually be playing on the RG Vita Pro, you're looking at somewhere between 5 and 8 hours of gameplay overall, which I think is pretty decent. This Pro version also charges a little bit faster. According to its spec sheet, it should go up to 18 watts. In my own testing, I found it only got to around 15 watts no matter what charger or cable that I used, and so take that with a grain of salt whether or not it's going to get all the way up to 18 watts, but 15 is fast enough for me. As far as connectivity, we've got Wi-Fi 6 and Bluetooth 5.2, and it also does have a 3.5mm headphone jack. The Wi-Fi performance on this was surprisingly good, which we'll talk about near the end of the video when I go into the streaming experience. As far as operating system, I already mentioned that it can dual boot into either Android 14 or Linux, and we also have 2 different options for each of them as of making this video. And finally, one other point, this thing actually has dual video out capability. You can use mini HDMI through the top port, and it also connects via USB-C to give you DisplayPort video out. I tested both features and they work fine on both Android and the stock Linux operating systems. It's really just plug and play. This screen is going to be mirrored onto your external display, and it's going to be 1080p and 60 Hz. Everything looks and feels pretty good. Of note, the USB-C port, in addition to providing video out, will also charge back at the same time, but it's a slow trickle charge. In fact, after playing it for about 10 minutes, my battery percentage actually went down even though it said it was charging. So my take is if you want to have it docked and actually charge it at the same time, I would use HDMI out for the video and then the USB-C for charging. Either way, I'm happy to see that there are 2 different video out options. This is the first time I've ever seen that from an Anbernic device. Now in terms of pricing, the RG Vita Pro is more expensive than I thought it would be. It's actually $150 retail before shipping. For the first few days of sale, they had a $10 discount, so it was going for $140 retail, but by the time this video comes out, it's going to be that full $150. And this price point is 2 things at once. Number one, it's a reflection reflection of how expensive some of these electronics are getting, especially when it comes to RAM and storage prices. So I do think that this is probably a precursor to more expensive handhelds that we'll see in the future. At the same time, this elevated price point puts it dangerously close to other Anbernic devices that are much more powerful, like the RG476H, which also happens to have double the RAM. We'll talk about this more near the end of the video, but if you're looking for the best bang for your buck, the most performance for your dollar, the RG Vita Pro is definitely not that. Okay, inside the box, we've got the RG Vita Pro itself, and then underneath that, we've got an instruction manual and then a USB cable for charging, and that's it. And first impression out of the box is that this thing actually looks and feels a little bit more like an actual PS Vita compared to the previous RG Vita that I had looked at before. Here's a look at them side by side, and you can see that the non-Pro version to me just looks a little bit odd, like it has a Game Boy aesthetic to it, but then also this PS Vita-like design. On the other hand, the Pro version has this black, sleek look to it that kind of reminds me of the 1000 series of the PS Vita, except for the colored buttons that we have right here. Now, the non-Pro version does have a black model that doesn't have colored buttons, so if you're looking for that specific look, you can find that on that one. The Pro model, by the way, also has a white version with white buttons with colored labels like this as well. As far as size, you can see that the RG Vita Pro is quite a bit bigger than the PS Vita, which only has a 5-inch display, so there's about maybe an inch of difference here in overall width, and then it's quite a bit bigger than the original PSP, which you can see is maybe about 1.5 inches larger overall. And so even though the design kind of looks like a PS Vita, the actual feel of this one is quite a bit different, which I talked about a lot in that previous video. The body design is very similar to a PS Vita. You can see like the way that the buttons and the sticks are laid out. It also has an all-glass front like the 1000 series, and it also has these cutouts right here for the shoulder buttons. But other than that, it is very classic Anbernic. The face buttons are membrane, and so they're kind of squishy, much like other Anbernic devices. They feel more like a Super Nintendo controller than something you would find on a PlayStation device. Same thing with the D-pad, which is membrane-based, which means it's a little bit squishy, again, more like a Nintendo product than something from Sony. Compared to the Sony version, this thing is also quite hollow. I think it's because they added some thickness here to allow for ventilation. This thing has no active cooling to it, and so they're hoping the heat will dissipate from the CPU. It is worth noting this device does get a little bit toasty, both on the front near the face buttons as well as on the back near where the CPU is. The hottest I saw it get was around 39 degrees Celsius in those particular points. The rest of the device doesn't get very warm at all, but those concentrated points do get a little bit warm in my hands. My general rule of thumb is that as long as it's around 40 degrees or less, it's something that I will notice but not necessarily bother me, and that's exactly the case right here. So I think for most people it'll probably be just fine, but it is worth noting that if you're going to try to push this device, it will get a little bit toasty in your hands. Overall, I've come to appreciate the look and feel of the overall Anbernic RG Vita design. It is a bit of an odd duck in that it looks a bit like a PS Vita from afar, but once you actually have it in the hands, it definitely feels like an Anbernic handheld and more Nintendo-esque. That said, I like the fact that it's relatively slim and pretty easy to put in your pocket if you have one that's large enough. For reference, here it is compared to my iPhone 15 Pro non-Max version, and you can see that yes, the Anbernic is quite a bit wider. In terms of overall size, it's about the same as a Retroid Pocket 5 or Retroid Pocket 6, which both have 5.5-inch displays, but these ones are a little bit thicker because they have these ergonomic bumps, and so I would say these are less pocketable than the Anbernic. One of my favorite things about a design like this with a rounded side and then a flat back is that it's very easy to shift your hand around as needed depending on what controls you need to focus on. So a D-pad centric game is going to feel very comfortable. You can shift your hand down a little bit and then play an analog stick centric game as well, and it's all going to feel great. And so yeah, overall, I think it's a comfortable handheld. I've been playing this for about a week now, and there hasn't been a time when I thought that it wasn't very ergonomic. Okay, let's talk a bit more about the controls and everything else on the device. We'll start with the D-pad. I already mentioned that it's rubber membrane, and it's actually a very accurate D-pad. It easily passes the contra test where I press down and then rock it left and right to see how much the character moves, and yes, I'm not getting any false diagonals. At the same time, playing something like Street Fighter 3 feels very good. I'm able to Hadouken and Shoryuken no problem. It's pretty obvious that they took some design cues from the original PS Vita. They have that X etched into the center here, but in other respects it's not the same. It's a matte kind of texture compared to glossy, and then this is a dome switch D-pad on the PS Vita, whereas the Anbernic one is a rubber membrane. So if anything, I would say that, yeah, it's a comfortable D-pad and I'm able to use it in a variety of different games, but it does feel a little bit inauthentic compared to the original one on the PS Vita, but that may not matter to you. The analog sticks are great on this. They have a full range of motion. They are hall sensor. You can turn off or adjust the RGB lighting in the settings if you would like, and the caps also can pull off too if you want to replace them with something else from the community or one from a different brand, because they all use the standard pull. Just by nature of its design, this is not a handheld I would want to play first-person shooter games on just because it doesn't have leverage on the bottom, but overall it's at least comfortable to be able to access all the controls at once. And single analog stick gameplay, or even those that where you adjust the camera on the right, all that has been fine for me. I like the face buttons here. They're very typical Anbernic, so they are rubber membrane, they're bouncy, and they also have a glossy texture to them. Also on the front, we've got some menu buttons, so select and start on the right, and then we have a back or home button here for Android, and then also an RG button, which can be used as a menu button or also to launch a front end of your choice. Up top, we've got our power button, volume up and down, an additional function button, which can be programmed in the settings, and then that mini HDMI port for video out, and then our USB-C for video out and charging. The shoulder and trigger buttons are digital input, which means that the trigger button just clicks down like this. It's a little bit loud, but not too bad. And overall, the buttons are easy to press down on. Because this is a digital trigger, that means that for games like racing games where you're trying to use the throttle, say for example with an Android game or with game streaming, it's just going to be a 100% input. Same thing with GameCube games, but as I'll show you later, the actual performance on here means you're probably not going to be playing a lot of GameCube games. On the back, we've got the Anbernic logo and then a couple cutouts here like the PS Vita, and then we also have some ventilation up top. Like I mentioned, there is no active cooling fan on this device, and so this is really just going to be passive cooling. And then finally, on the bottom, we've got our two stereo speakers, our headphone jack, and then two micro SD card slots. Now, even though the speakers are down-firing, they do get quite loud, and I think they're relatively decent for a $150-ish device. Let me give you a listen right here. So overall, I would say the audio experience gets the job done. It's nothing to write home about, but I have definitely seen worse even at this price point. Okay, now let's talk a bit about the screen. The non-Pro version of the Vita is a different screen altogether, different resolution, completely different panel, and this one is a lot better. To start, the non-Pro version had very desaturated colors, and I'm not seeing it here on the Pro model. Like, all the colors are nice and poppy. Now, this is an LCD panel, so it's not going to look as good as OLED, but I think it definitely gets the job done. Another issue I brought up in my previous video is the non-Pro version had this weird over-sharpening effect, which has happened with all the other Android devices that Anbernic has released with this particular chipset. I'm happy to report that this device doesn't have any of those issues whatsoever. It's got a nice clean display. It's also got a decent amount of peak brightness. I can play this outdoors, either in the shade or even in direct sunlight, and it's still visible. And that was something that didn't really happen with the non-Pro version. That was a very dim screen. At the same time, this one also gets quite dim. This is at 0% brightness, and you can barely see anything on the screen, even when I turn off the studio lights. So this will be a device that you can play in the dark as well. My only major complaint about this device is that you have to make it quite bright to make it visible. For most of the devices that I test here in the studio, I usually put it at 50% brightness, which is what it's at right here. And you can see that this is just way too dim. And so you would have to push it up to about 75-80% brightness to get the same as other devices that are running at 50. So the way I see it, this will be great in low light settings because you have all that distance right here where it's going to be nice and dim, but you will have to crank it up quite a bit if you're in a brighter environment setting. So take it or leave it. It really depends on where you're going to be playing this device. I've never really had any issues in terms of overall brightness other than the fact that I kind of have to crank it up a bit. Now let's talk about software a bit. Now we've got a couple different options because this thing can dual boot, and we'll start with Android. So this is the stock build right here. It's going to come preloaded with a bunch of emulators, and what I did is I just added my own right here, and so that's how I did all my testing. It's worth noting the stock Android does not have Google Play services. That means that it's not going to run apps like Google Chrome. You can see it has Chromium right here, and it also does not have Google Play Store, so you cannot install any of those apps from there. Nowadays, when it comes to emulation, you don't really need the Google Play Store. You can sideload all the apps that you need, but at the same time, there might be some Android games that you want to play, and they may not work properly on this because you'll have to sideload them. Other than that, it's going to be a pretty typical Anbernic Android experience. You can swipe down from the top right here, and you can adjust adjust things like the RGB lights around your sticks, or you can change the ABXY pattern right here, or you can do things like turning it between auto mode and what they call high mode, which is supposed to affect performance, but I've personally found that it doesn't actually do anything. And so I've toggled between them in my performance testing, and it's all been the same. Now, in addition to Android, you can also boot into Linux. So my device came with a 32 gigabyte card, which I put in my first SD card slot, and then that booted into this Linux experience right here, which is very reminiscent of their XX line of devices, where you've got your game rooms, your RA or RetroArch games, then you've got your search and your apps, and then your favorites and history, and then your settings. Now, even though the main menu looks like it's something from one of those devices, it's actually running something that's akin to Emulation Station. If we press start, you can see the menu right here looks very similar to something like Rocknix or Jealous. I'm not really sure what software they're borrowing from. My guess would be one of those or from Vita, but you can see right here that a lot of the user settings are going to be very similar. Now, my test device also came with a second microSD card that was loaded up with a bunch of games. I'm sure you can probably buy that from their website as well. And so if I actually put that in here and then go into one of these settings, it'll show all of the games that are preloaded on this device. So you could use this as like a preloaded console if you wanted to use their own SD card. At the same time, you could also just put in a blank micro SD card. It'll populate it with all the folders that you need, and then you can drag and drop all of your games there too. So you've got a couple different options with their stock Linux firmware. As far as which of these stock operating systems are going to work best for you, it's really going to come down to what you prefer. So Android is going to give you a lot more customization and more access to other apps that you won't find on Linux. But the Linux operation is going to be very simple because you just have to put in that second micro SD card, let it populate the folders, drag and drop your games, and that's it. At the same time, the Linux operating system is a little bit ugly. You basically can just navigate through here. It feels very dated compared to something like on Android, where you can use other front ends like Cocoon or Emulation Station and really tailor it to however you want it to be. So between the two, I think that Android's going to give you more options in terms of customization and just making it look pretty compared to the other. But if you want something that's more plug and play, then obviously the Linux one is going to be easier. That being said, we do have a couple community options that are on their way very soon. On the Android side, we've got a new version of Gamma OS, which will be released publicly for this device in the next few days as of making this video. I've been talking to the developer about it. He's got some really interesting features that are coming for this particular build. One feature is called Nano Boot, which will essentially just be a pared down version of Android that will allow you to boot into your game super fast. And it's also got a cool feature where if you're in the middle of a game, you can just turn the device off and it'll resume where you are in that game when you start it up again. That's not normally something you see in Android, so I'm very happy to see it here. Another exciting thing he's adding is what he's calling GammaPad. So this is a universal control scheme. So this means that if you connect it to a Bluetooth controller, it's going to work at the system level exactly like the controller on the device itself. This means that you can effectively dock your device by plugging it into an external monitor, connect it with a Bluetooth controller, and then immediately start playing without having to remap anything, which is one of the biggest pain points when it comes to docking on Android. Another really cool feature is that he's implemented system-level RetroArch slang shaders that can work across all of Android. That means no matter what you're playing, an Android game or maybe something outside of RetroArch, you can still apply those shaders to everything. I'll be sure to update the video description when this goes live. It's going to be free and open to the public as soon as it launches, and so I'll have that link down below. Now on the Linux side, there's already an alpha build of Newly, which is a Linux-based operating system that is a fork of Vita made for handheld devices. Now Newly is actually focused on more low-powered handhelds like the XX devices from Anbernic, but now we have it working on this device, and so as a result, they're including new and updated emulators for things like PS2 and GameCube. This is all kind of still a work in progress. Now in order to get access to the alpha builds of Newly, you've got to be a Ko-fi supporter. I'll leave it linked down below as well. You just throw them a few dollars, then they'll give you access to a special Discord channel where you can download the latest build. Once the operating system comes out of alpha and it's ready for a public release, then they will release that for everybody as well. So if you don't want to pay for it, you can just wait until that comes, but sometimes that can take several months. Either way, there are some excellent benefits to using Newly over something like Android. Number one is that this is a Linux-based operating system, so all you have to do is just flash a micro SD card, and this is going to be your OS, and then you can put all your games on a second micro SD card, and that's exactly what I've done here. here. Now, what I did is I initially let it populate for the newly folders, then I added all my games, and then I went back to Android and then used all those apps to point to this same second SD card. So I'm able to use the exact same games on the two different operating systems. And beyond the easy setup of Linux, you also have a couple things that you can't find on Android, including Portmaster, which gives you access to PC ports directly on your Linux-based device. And there are quite a few different games that you can play here. There are over 1,300 games available on Portmaster right now. So if anything, I would say that the software options that we have for the RG Vita Pro is looking pretty darn good. The stock operating system is not half bad, both on Android and Linux, and we've already got some custom options in the works as well. Now let's talk a bit about performance. We've got a couple of benchmarks I'll talk about, then we'll do some real-world testing. We'll start with Wildlife Extreme. This is more GPU-intensive tests, so mostly going to be used for things like Android games and high-level emulation. And I'm going to use Wildlife Extreme as our test base here. The score on the RG Vita Pro is 279, making it quite a bit better than the Mangmi Air X, which retails for around $100. And then also I wanted to use the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus as an example here because this one has the T618 chipset, same one that you can find on the non-pro version of the RG Vita. Now, the non-pro version that I have isn't working, so I'm not able to actually get into any of these apps because the ghost touches are so bad. So we're going to use this as our example, comparing the non-pro versus the pro. And you can see here that yes, the pro does have more performance power compared to the non-pro. At the same time, this score is not all that great compared to other devices that are a bit more expensive. For example, the Anbernic RG476H, which only is like $10 or $15 more retail, this one has a much higher score, over double that of the RG Vita Pro. And then if you want to look at the Retroid Pocket 5, which retails for $200 right now before shipping, you can see that it's 1,000 points better than the RG Vita Pro in this exact same test. So earlier when I was saying that the RG Vita Pro is not the best bang for your buck, this is mostly what I'm pointing to here, is that yes, for around $150 before shipping, you can find devices just a little bit more that are twice as good as far as GPU performance, and then other devices for $50 more that can blow it out of the water. Now, if we do the Geekbench 6 CPU benchmark, you can see that the scores here are kind of the same as well. You can see that this here's got 364 as a single core score and 1285 multi-core, which is going to be half or less than of that of the RG476H. And again, the Retroid Pocket 5 just completely decimates it. And CPU performance is very important when it comes to emulation, which means that for playing higher end systems, something like the RG476H is going to be much better, about $10, $15 more. And then, of course, the Retroid Pocket 5 is going to be your best bet if you're looking for something around the $200 price point. Now, looking at these weaker devices, this is where things get very interesting. You can see that the single core score is about the same between the Mangmi as well as the RG Vita Pro. And then the Retroid Pocket 3 or the T618 single core score is actually a little bit better. It's very similar with the multi-core score as well, with the T618 actually outperforming the RG Vita Pro when it comes to raw CPU performance, which is going to be important when it comes to emulation. At the same time, the Mangmi Air X has slightly weaker performance power, but with a chipset that on paper looks a lot worse than that on the RG Vita Pro. And this one also has the benefit of a Snapdragon processor. It's an older one, but that does help when it comes to GPU performance. And so looking at these numbers, you're probably already drawing some conclusions, and that in terms of emulation, this is going to be pretty similar to the other devices, and that's pretty spot on. They're all going to be able to play through PSP no problem, and you're going to struggle with things like GameCube and PS2, and that's exactly what I found here. So let's go ahead and start jumping into real-world testing. And for my testing, we're going to do everything in stock Android first, and then we'll move on to the other operating systems to show some differences between them. Starting with the very lightweight stuff like Game Boy and Game Boy Color, these are obviously going to perform just fine. Now, this is a 16:9 aspect ratio device, so playing games like this with a 10:9 aspect ratio is going to give you wide borders on the left and right. One of the nice things about an all-glass front here on a black device is that those bezels just kind of melt into the background. Not quite as good as they do on an OLED panel, but still works out pretty well here. Systems that are a bit wider, like the Game Boy Advance with its 3:2 aspect ratio, are going to look much better here just because they fill out the screen a little bit more nicely. And so like with a lot of other wider base 3D-based handhelds, Game Boy Advance is going to be a standout feature on this device just because it looks so good. 4x3 systems also look very good here. You do get some black borders on the left and right, but again, with a black device with an all-glass front, it does kind of melt away. It's worth noting that CRT shaders on this device do not work very well just because we don't have enough power. So something like CRT Geom doesn't work at all. You're going to have to use something like Z-Fast CRT instead. It's still a decent shader, but if you're looking for something with a bit more of an elevated experience, we don't have the power for that here. Moving on to 3D-based systems, here's PlayStation 1 using the DuckStation emulator, and this is running just great. I personally was playing them at a 3x resolution, but you've got enough power here to be able to push it up all the way up to like a 5x if you wanted. For me, I've really settled on a 3x resolution as something that's kind of a mix between a little bit upscale, but then also feeling very retro. Sega Dreamcast works great. You can upscale it to 720p and even turn on things like widescreen hacks to take advantage of the full display. And yes, all of this plays just fine within the Flycast core in RetroArch. Some games like Sonic 2 did struggle when I pushed it to a 1080p upscale, so I think 720p is going to be where the magic happens. It was a similar case with Nintendo 64. Most lightweight games played at 720p no problem, and some of these do actually support widescreen hacks as well, as you can see here with Super Mario 64. However, once I got to harder to play games like Cruisin' USA, the Mupen 64 core within RetroArch just really wasn't up to snuff, and so I was not able to play this game upscaled at 720p. That being said, the standalone version of Mupen 64 Plus worked absolutely fine, even upscaled, and so for the harder to play games, that may be the way to go. So it'll be up to you whether or not you want to mix and match between RetroArch and the ability to easily use widescreen hacks for the games that support it, or if you want to use the standalone Mupen just to get better performance across the board. Sega Saturn was a bit more hit and miss, so I did find that some games like Nights into Dreams and even Sega Rally and Championship played absolutely fine with the Yabasan Shiro core with no upscaling whatsoever. This is not the ideal way to play these games just because it's not quite as accurate as something like the Beetle Saturn core, but I think it's still going to be a pretty good experience. However, if you're really trying to focus on Sega Saturn, I think there are better options out there, including other handhelds, but then also other ways to play these games, including Linux-based firmware, which we'll talk about later. Some games like Panzer Dragoon was not actually playing at full speed. I was getting some stutters here and there. It's not running at a full 60. Other games like Virtua Fighter 2 had some text issues that was kind of flickering, and so there are better options out there, which we'll explore in a minute. By far, my favorite system to play on this device was Sony PSP, which is kind of fitting considering that this is kind of shaped like a PSP altogether. In terms of performance, I was able to play just about every single game at a 3x resolution upscale, and many of them at a 4x resolution upscale as well. For reference, 3x is going to be 720p and 4x is 1080p, so 4x would be ideal, but honestly, 3x still looks very good. Regardless, all of the games that I threw at it played absolutely fine, and the only games I had to make any adjustment to were the God of War games. These ones played better at a 2x resolution upscale compared to 3. And even then, the vast majority of the game played just fine at a 3x resolution upscale, but I got a couple stutters here and there, so that's when I dropped it down to a 2x just to make sure I got a very smooth gameplay experience. Now, right about here, you might be expecting me to show some PS Vita gameplay. After all, you can emulate this on Android, but I gotta say, for the RG Vita and the RG Vita Pro, it's really just not worth it unless you're trying to play very lightweight games. As I demonstrated in my other video last month, Android is just not the way to play Vita games. The emulator itself is still very early in its development, and it also heavily relies on custom GPU shaders which are only available on Snapdragon processors, and this device is not one of those. So in general, you're going to find that the vast majority of time with either of these devices, PS Vita is not going to be worth setting up. It is, of course, ironic considering the name of this device, but no, this is not a PS Vita device at all. Moving on to other systems, let's talk about GameCube and PS2. We'll start with GameCube, and I'm happy to say that there are some lightweight games that you could play on here. It's going to be similar to other devices like the non-pro version of the RG Vita, where you have to be very choosy about which games are even going to play at full speed. Lightweight games like Mario Tennis and Mario Kart are going to be absolutely fine, but once you start getting into something a little bit harder, like Pokemon Colosseum or even F-Zero, it's going to tank quite a bit. You're going to be playing at about half speed altogether. together. So like with a lot of these cheaper devices, I would not recommend buying it to play GameCube games on, but you might be pleasantly surprised here and there. It's going to be a similar story with PlayStation 2, although I did find the performance on this was quite a bit worse than GameCube. Every single game that I played did not play at full speed, even easier to run games like Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3. Once you get into something more demanding like Ratchet and Clank, it's going to be a lot harder to run. And then of course something like God of War 2, forget about it. Now, there are hacks and other tricks that you can do to potentially improve performance here, but it never is going to get to the point where I would consider the system to be playable. In fact, I would say that the non-pro version of the RG Vita has given me better results than the pro version right here, which was pretty surprising. Moving along, another system I tested was Nintendo 3DS, and this one plays surprisingly well. I played most games at a 3x resolution upscale, and it played absolutely fine. This obviously is not the ideal way to play 3DS games because you have to put the two screens side by side, but if you're desperate to play one of these, then I think this does get the job done. Moving on from there, let's talk about Nintendo Switch emulation, and only very lightweight games are going to run, and because we're using a Mali GPU that doesn't have custom GPU drivers, overall compatibility is going to be quite bad. Many games like Celeste that play absolutely fine on lower powered hardware would crash before I got to actual gameplay, which is not a good sign. So when it comes down to it, much like GameCube, I would say that only very few and very lightweight games are going to play at full speed at all. If you look at something like Hollow Knight Silksong, this is a pretty lightweight game. It's only running at about 15-20 frames per second, so even this one does not play at full speed. Now, I'm always a glutton for punishment, so I did test it a little bit further, this time with PC games via an app called Game Native, which allows you to play your Steam games directly on an Android device. For the most part, I only play this app on Snapdragon-based devices because performance and stability is much better. There were a couple games I was able to play at a pretty good frame rate, like Shovel Knight. This one did have some graphical glitches when I was scrolling through the game, but otherwise, yeah, it was at least playing at a close to full speed. But from there, the vast majority of other games that I played would either crash and not run at all, or they were only playing at around 15 or 20 frames per second, making them unplayable for me. So again, like with some of these other systems, you might be able to squeeze out a couple here or there, but for the most part, this is going to be a PSP and below device. Now, one very surprising thing for me is that it does an excellent job with game streaming. In fact, the overall decoding time here with Artemis and Apollo was between 1.5 and 2 milliseconds on average. That is honestly better than most of the devices that I've tested before, even those with a high-end Snapdragon chipset. So if you're looking to play something streaming, this is going to be an excellent device for that. That was very surprising. So when it comes down to it, if you do have a pretty beefy PC and you want to stream games from that onto your device, that's going to be an excellent way to do it. You can even use that for high-end emulation. You could play your GameCube, PS2, and Switch games on your PC, streaming over to your handheld, instead of trying to play them natively on the device. Let's talk about the stock Linux experience, which is going to be performance-wise a little bit worse than Android. So you do have access to things like GameCube as well as PS2 on the Linux side here, but I did find that the performance is a little bit worse. However, performance for systems like PSP and below were absolutely fine. I was still able to play these at the exact same settings as the Android build, so 2x for God of War and then 3x for all the other games when playing PSP. So if you're looking to just play PSP and below and you want a very simple Linux experience, then yes, you can use the stock Linux operating system. It works absolutely fine. However, if you really want to push the device and see what you can squeeze out of it, then I do think that Android is going to be your better bet if you're sticking with stock. Now for Newly, which is the other custom Linux-based operating system, they're still working on some of these higher-end systems. So even though you can boot into PS2 and GameCube as well as 3DS, the performance is quite wonky and the settings still need to be configured. After all, this is an alpha build, so they're still working on it. However, for everything else, PSP and below, Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast, all those are playing absolutely fine so far on this alpha build of Newly. And one system that's running better compared to Android is actually Sega Saturn. This one is using the standalone Yabasan Shiro app, and it's running great. This one has auto frame skip, which allows you to get over the hump in terms of performance with some of these harder to play games. In addition, I did find that the graphical accuracy was a little bit better on the Linux side compared to Android too. So games like Virtua Fighter 2 play absolutely fine, including the text. So the way I see it, if you want to play Sega Saturn, then Newly is probably going to be the way to go compared to Android, just because this app runs a little bit better. And then of course, like I mentioned before, you have access to Portmaster on Newly, which is an amazing resource if you want to play PC games on Linux, and this works absolutely fine. I tried a bunch of commercial ports and some ready-to-run games, and they all were playing great. And so if you're looking for a nice little Portmaster machine that has quite a bit of power, around $150, this might be a pretty good fit. Okay, that's it for testing. Let's go ahead and start wrapping up and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the RG Vita Pro so far. Like I mentioned already, I don't really consider this to be a final review just yet, just because the software is still a work in progress, but I think we've got enough to make a quick judgment. Let's start with what I like, and number one, I've grown to appreciate the sleek design on the RG Vita Pro, especially in the black color, just because it is a bit more reminiscent of the actual PS Vita. Even though the buttons are not quite like the original PS Vita, they're still a very good control experience, so I've got no deal breakers here. I also think it's a decent screen. It's got a 1080p resolution and none of the issues that I found in the non-pro version of the RG Vita, and I honestly think that it's probably one of the better 1080p displays that we've seen from Anbernic. Also, thanks to its design, it is a comfortable device. I'm able to play analog stick and D-pad centric games no problem. One of my favorite things in testing this device is all the different operating system options we have, because it can dual boot into both Linux and Android. And so if you're someone who likes to mess around with this kind of stuff, you're going to find a lot of fun options here. It can be a bit of a double-edged sword in having to maintain multiple different operating systems and booting back and forth depending on the game that you're playing, but in general, I do have fun with that kind of thing. As far as performance, I think it's great for PSP and below, and I did find that streaming was an unexpected surprise. This thing has a really low decoding time. As far as what I don't like about it, I've only got a few things, but they are some pretty heavy hitters. Number one is that this is not a PS Vita. Every time I see the name of this handheld, I get a little bit worried that people are just going to buy it because they think they can play PS Vita games on it, so I have to put that warning out there. Not only is PS Vita emulation very early in its development on Android in general, but then also it doesn't really feel like a PS Vita either. It kind of looks like one, but it doesn't feel like it. Another thing to be mindful of is that the device does get a little bit warm because it doesn't have active cooling. It's never to the point where I would consider it to be hot, but if you don't like your devices getting warm, then this may not be a good fit. And then finally, the biggest deal breaker here is the price point. At $150 retail before shipping, I'm not really sure where this lands in the whole spectrum of handhelds available today. On the lower end, we've got something like the Mangmi Air X, which retails for $100, has a very similar form factor, excellent controls, and a 1080p display, but it's $100 compared to $150. The performance on the Vita Pro is a little bit better, and this one also can dual boot into Linux, so those have a couple additional perks, but I'm not sure that's worth an additional $50. When it comes down to it, both of these devices can play PSP and below, and so if you're looking to get the best bang for your buck at around $100, then this one would be my choice. If you're willing to spend a little bit more money, about $10 or $15, then the Anbernic RG476H would be my recommendation. This one has a much more powerful processor. This one can play a good amount of GameCube and PS2 games compared to this one. The display on this one I would say is much better suited for retro gaming, so if you're looking to play something with a 4:3 aspect ratio on this display, which is 4.7 inches and runs at 120 Hz, this would be my recommendation right here. Now, if you're looking to just play mostly PSP or Game Boy Advance games, then I could see the RG Vita Pro being a better fit there. But for all the other systems that play at a 4:3 aspect ratio, including things like Dreamcast, Nintendo 64, GameCube, PS2, then this one is a much easier recommendation. And then finally, if you're willing to consider a $150 device like the RG Vita Pro, then I think it's also in your interest to consider the Retroid Pocket 5 for $200. Now, this is last year's model, so it's not the latest and greatest, but this is still a very decent handheld. It's got the Snapdragon 865, which means you can play just about every single PS2 and GameCube game upscaled on this one, no problem, and then a good amount of Nintendo Switch and game-native games and stuff like that too. This chipset can also dual boot into both Android and Linux, so if you want to have that fun tinkering aspect, you can do that as well. The displays are both 5.5 inches, but this one is OLED on the Retroid Pocket 5, which is a big difference in terms of quality. And so overall, I think that the $50 difference between the two makes the Retroid Pocket 5 a better deal overall. So putting it all together, do I recommend the Anbernic RG Vita Pro? And I would say that at this $150 retail plus shipping price point, it's very hard to recommend. I think the people who are going to enjoy this the most are those who want a sleek looking device that kind of reminds them of a PS Vita, but has those tried and true Anbernic controls. And don't get me wrong, it is an excellent device when it comes to playing PSP games and below. And I also love the fact that I can dual boot into Linux as well, and then tinker to my heart's content. At the end of the day, there is nothing unique about the RG Vita Pro that we haven't seen before. It's got a pretty cool design, but overall, it does feel a bit like just a standard Anbernic release. When it comes down to it, there are cheaper devices that give you a similar experience, and there's also slightly more expensive devices that can give you a much better experience, which leaves the RG Vita Pro in a very strange spot. Let me know what you think in the comments down below and whether or not you're picking one of these up. Personally, I just think it's priced a little bit too high. And who knows, we might see discounts in the future. I personally think that if we can find this around the $100 or $120 price point, that might make it a more compelling option. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.